The sweltering tropical heat radiated across Asto Airfield on Saipan as American military personnel advanced inland during the month of June 1944. Amidst the wreckage of shattered aircraft hangars and pockmarked runways, Japanese ground crews unexpectedly sighted something that momentarily diverted their attention from the relentless artillery bombardment: a downed F6F Hellcat, remarkably well preserved, resting amidst the tall vegetation near the perimeter. This was not merely debris. It represented an invaluable opportunity. For almost 2 years, Japanese aviators had been submitting increasingly desperate dispatches detailing a formidable new American fighter aircraft that was systematically decimating their aerial formations with unprecedented efficiency. The Hellcat had made its combat debut in August 1943, and within a mere few months, it had profoundly reshaped the balance of air superiority in the Pacific theater. However, intelligence briefings and pilot testimonies could only provide a limited scope of understanding. Here, at last, was the tangible article, the very aircraft that was methodically annihilating Japanese naval aviation, now sitting idly, awaiting meticulous scrutiny. The salvage operation commenced without delay, even as the ferocious battle for Saipan raged around them. Ground personnel toiled under sporadic enemy fire to relocate the fighter to a more secure position, eventually preparing it for shipment back to mainland Japan. Every passing hour was critical. American forces were making swift progress, and this invaluable prize could not be allowed to revert to enemy possession. The Hellcat symbolized more than just a single airplane. It offered a profound insight into American industrial and engineering philosophy, a critical chance to comprehend the exact nature of the formidable adversary Japan was confronting. By the close of June, as Saipan fully succumbed to American dominion, the captured Hellcat was already making its journey toward the Japanese mainland. It ultimately arrived at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, where some of Japan's most brilliant aeronautical engineers eagerly anticipated its dissection, both figuratively and literally. The initial external appraisal unveiled an aircraft that appeared undeniably brutish when juxtaposed with the graceful contours of Japanese fighters. It possessed a greater weight, a thicker profile, and a more substantial presence in every dimension. Where Japanese fighter designs pursued elegance and agility through rigorous weight reduction, this American machine seemed to embrace sheer mass. The engineers circumnavigated it slowly on that inaugural day, meticulously taking measurements, running their hands over its riveted panels, and scrutinizing its broad wings and the massive cowling that enveloped its powerful engine. They carefully observed the substantial armor plating position behind the pilot's seat, robust enough to withstand rifle-caliber projectiles. They also noted the exceptionally sturdy landing gear, expressly engineered to endure the immense stresses inherent in carrier-based operations. Furthermore, they examined the formidable armament of 6.50 caliber machine guns, 3 integrated into each wing, complemented by ammunition boxes capable of holding hundreds of rounds. Every facet of the Hellcat's design underscored a philosophy that unequivocally prioritized pilot survival, sustained offensive capability, and rugged dependability over the pure performance metrics that had guided Japanese fighter development for the preceding decade. What they observed transcended a mere fighter aircraft. It was a physical manifestation of America's immense industrial capacity and a fundamentally different conceptualization of what constituted an effective combat aircraft. The engineers understood that deciphering this machine might represent Japan's final opportunity to devise an adequate countermeasure to American air superiority. As they prepared to embark on the detailed examination, they had no inkling of the extent of the revelations this captured fighter would provide, nor how disheartening those discoveries would ultimately prove to be. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. By mid-1944, Japanese naval aviation was experiencing a catastrophic decline in the skies over the Pacific, a fact universally acknowledged. Yet few were willing to confront the full scope of the predicament. The Mitsubishi A6M0, which had instilled terror in Allied pilots throughout 1941 and 1942, had now become a veritable death trap. American pilots had keenly identified its inherent weaknesses: deficient high-speed handling characteristics, an almost complete absence of armor protection, and wing structures prone to failure under the severe G-forces encountered during high-speed dives. Crucially, the Americans had developed fighter aircraft specifically engineered to exploit these vulnerabilities, with the Hellcat standing prominently at the forefront of this formidable list. The intelligence chasm confronting Japanese aviation was utterly debilitating. Pilots fortunate enough to return from combat, and such instances were tragically few, relate accounts of American fighters that could absorb extraordinary levels of damage and continue to operate. They vividly described aircraft capable of diving away from a zero at velocities that would render pursuit an act of suicide. They reported a devastating firepower that could obliterate a Japanese fighter with a single, concentrated burst. However, these urgent reports from traumatized pilots, delivered amidst the chaos of battle, did not constitute engineering data. They could not provide precise bore and stroke measurements, compression ratios, wing loading figures, or intricate fuel system specifications. They were unable to elucidate how the Americans had successfully resolved complex technical challenges that Japanese engineers continued to grapple with. The situation had escalated to such a critical point that by early 1944, Japanese naval air groups operating in the Pacific were suffering pilot losses at a rate exceeding their capacity to train replacements. The First Air Fleet had been utterly decimated at the Philippine Sea in June 1944, a battle famously dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. In a single day of combat on June 19, Japan endured the loss of approximately 300 aircraft and their irreplaceable cadre of highly trained pilots. The Hellcat had served as the primary instrument in that devastating slaughter, accounting for the overwhelming majority of aerial victories. What rendered this crisis particularly acute was the increasingly isolated operational environment of Japan's aeronautical engineering establishment. American aircraft were undergoing rapid evolution, with new models and variants emerging consistently, each incorporating valuable lessons gleaned from combat experience and significant technological advancements. While Japanese intelligence occasionally managed to acquire general specifications through various clandestine channels, they remained unable to decipher the practical engineering solutions that enabled these specifications. How did American engines achieve such prodigious power output while simultaneously maintaining exceptional reliability? How did their aircraft endure damage that would unequivocally obliterate a Japanese fighter? What specific materials and manufacturing methodologies allowed them to construct such robust structures without incurring unacceptable weight penalties? The captured Hellcat represented precisely what Japanese engineers so desperately required: verifiable, hard data. Not mere estimations, not combat reports filtered through the pervasive fog of war, and certainly not speculative deductions based on distant observations. Here was an actual American fighter aircraft that they could meticulously measure, accurately weigh, systematically disassemble, and rigorously test. They could meticulously examine every single component, critically analyze every engineering decision, and thoroughly comprehend every design compromise. They could, at long last, definitively answer the vexing questions that had plagued them since late 1943, when the Hellcat first appeared in substantial numbers. Furthermore, there was a profound psychological dimension to the capture that extended beyond purely technical intelligence. Japanese aviation had been founded upon an unwavering belief in the inherent superiority of their design philosophy, that a fighter aircraft should unequivocally prioritize maneuverability and operational range above all other considerations, that exceptionally skilled pilots did not necessitate armor protection or heavy armament, and that aesthetic elegance in design inherently reflected combat superiority. The Zero had perfectly embodied this philosophy, and for a brief, fleeting period, it had undeniably dominated the Pacific skies. However, Japanese pilots were now perishing in alarming numbers, and the aircraft responsible for their demise represented a completely antithetical set of design priorities. Examining the Hellcat compelled them to confront the unsettling possibility that Japan's fundamental assumptions about fighter design had been erroneous from the very beginning. The Hellcat arrived at Yokosuka in various pieces, having been partially disassembled for logistical transport, yet with most major components sufficiently intact for a comprehensive examination. The recovery team had executed an extraordinary feat under intense combat conditions, successfully preserving the aircraft's essential systems despite the arduous circumstances of its capture. Engineers immediately instituted a rigorous systematic documentation process, meticulously photographing every single component before commencing any detailed examination. They understood that this might be their sole opportunity to meticulously study an intact example of America's most successful carrier-based fighter. The initial walk-around inspection alone spanned several days. Specialized teams of experts simultaneously scrutinized different aspects of the aircraft. Structural engineers concentrated on the airframe's integrity. Power plant specialists focused intently on the engine's complexities. Systems specialists meticulously studied the hydraulic and control mechanisms, and armament technicians diligently cataloged the intricate weapons installation. What universally struck everyone immediately was the sheer, undeniable robustness of the construction. Where Japanese fighters employed delicate assemblies and minimalist structures to achieve weight savings, the Hellcat utilized heavy forgings, substantial extrusions, and thick skin panels. The aircraft's empty weight registered approximately 9,200 pounds, a figure nearly double that of a Zero. The fuselage construction unveiled a fundamentally divergent approach to stressed skin design. Japanese engineers had become consummate masters at crafting exceptionally lightweight structures using thin aluminum, meticulously formed and assembled. In stark contrast, the Hellcat's fuselage employed heavier gauge aluminum complemented by more substantial internal framing. The engineers calculated that the fuselage alone could likely withstand structural loads that would unequivocally tear a Zero apart. I am from the United States, and I find the video topic fascinating. It really highlights the critical role of intelligence and engineering in warfare, and how quickly technological superiority can shift the balance of power. The desperation of the Japanese engineers facing a superior design really comes through. The structural analysis revealed an immense resilience, a durability that would unequivocally dismantle any attacking Zero. The American engineers discovered an extraordinary level of reinforcement in areas Japanese designers would have deemed entirely superfluous. This included supplementary framing encircling access hatches, additional doubler plates strategically positioned at points of intense stress, and robust bulkheads meticulously separating the primary fuselage sections. The Hellcat's wing architecture presented a particularly striking contrast. Its wings were ingeniously constructed around a colossal central section, forming a singular, unbroken structure that traversed the fuselage. This innovative design not only created an extraordinarily robust platform for the landing gear, but also afforded substantial protection for both the pilot and the crucial fuel tanks. In stark contrast, Japanese fighters typically employed lighter wing structures, attaching them to the fuselage at multiple points. While this approach conserved weight, it regrettably concentrated stress and offered significantly less inherent crash protection. Furthermore, the Hellcat's wings incorporated a formidable leading-edge structure, capable of absorbing considerable combat damage without experiencing catastrophic failure. Engineers mused that one could conceivably obliterate portions of the wing's outer panels, yet the aircraft would remarkably remain airborne. During those initial days of meticulous examination, the engineering team unearthed another profound revelation: irrefutable evidence of mass production techniques on a scale utterly beyond the capabilities of Japanese industry. The edges of panels exhibited clear indications of machine forming, rather than the painstaking handwork prevalent in Japanese manufacturing. Rivet patterns were flawlessly consistent, strongly suggesting automated or semi-automated assembly processes. Moreover, components demonstrated a degree of interchangeability rarely seen in Japanese aircraft, where skilled artisans frequently hand-fitted parts during assembly. The Hellcat, it became clear, had been conceived from its inception for rapid, high-volume production, designed to be assembled by a workforce that did not necessitate years of specialized training. As they meticulously documented every detail, a disquieting picture began to materialize. This was not merely a different fighter aircraft. It represented an entirely distinct industrial and engineering paradigm. The Hellcat embodied a deeply ingrained American philosophy, one that prioritized pilot lives over the marginal savings of a few hundred pounds, that valued unwavering reliability above squeezing out a few extra knots of speed, and that mandated an aircraft be capable of surviving not only enemy fire, but also the brutal exigencies of carrier operations and the inevitable mishaps inherent in high-tempo combat scenarios. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Every single design decision within the Hellcat unequivocally reflected priorities that Japanese aviation had systematically de-emphasized for years. The engineers, with their rigorous professional training, were adept enough to discern superior solutions when confronted with them, even when those solutions directly contradicted everything their own education had imparted about aircraft design. When the dedicated engine removal team finally extracted the formidable Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp from its Hellcat cowling, several engineers simply stood transfixed, staring in awe. They had, of course, reviewed the specifications and intelligence reports. A staggering 2,000 horsepower generated by an 18-cylinder, two-row radial engine. However, mere specifications on paper could not possibly convey the visceral reality of holding components from this mechanical behemoth in one's own hands. The engine alone weighed approximately 2,360 pounds, a mass substantially exceeding the total weight of entire Japanese fighters from just a few years prior. The painstaking disassembly process commenced with methodical precision. Engineers meticulously photographed each step, precisely measured every component, and diligently recorded detailed notes on the assembly techniques employed. The R2800 cylinder heads were the first to be removed, revealing combustion chambers and valve arrangements that immediately ignited intense discussion among the specialists. The bore measured a substantial 5.75 inches, with a stroke of 6 inches, resulting in a total displacement of 2,800 cubic inches, or almost 46 liters. For a comparative perspective, the Nakajima Sakai engine, which powered the iconic Zero, displaced only 27.9 liters and produced a mere 1,130 horsepower. The Americans were, astonishingly, extracting almost twice the power from an engine that wasn't even twice the displacement. Yet, displacement alone could not fully account for the profound performance disparity. As the engineers delved deeper into the R2800's intricate internals, they uncovered layer upon layer of sophisticated engineering solutions. The crankshaft itself was a colossal forging, machined to tolerances that Japanese manufacturing facilities consistently struggled to achieve. The connecting rods utilized advanced alloys and incorporated ingenious design features specifically intended to mitigate stress concentrations. The pistons bore clear evidence of sophisticated casting techniques and integrated cooling galleries, which effectively managed the immense heat generated by high compression ratios and aggressive ignition timing. The supercharger system, in particular, captivated the power plant specialists. The R2800 employed a highly advanced two-speed, two-stage supercharger, capable of maintaining high manifold pressure across an extensive range of altitudes. Japanese engines, conversely, typically utilize simpler, less effective supercharger designs, a compromise driven partly by manufacturing limitations and partly by an emphasis on low-altitude performance, where the majority of Pacific combat engagements transpired. The American supercharger represented a level of precision manufacturing that demanded machinery and quality control processes simply not possessed in sufficient quantity by Japanese industry. The fuel injection system unveiled yet another significant advantage. While many Japanese engines still relied on carburetors, which were prone to causing fuel starvation during negative G maneuvers, the R2800 employed a highly sophisticated injection system that delivered consistent fuel flow irrespective of the aircraft's attitude. This seemingly minor detail held profound combat implications. American pilots could execute aggressive negative G dives without their engines cutting out, whereas Zero pilots were forced to roll inverted before diving to maintain positive G and keep their engines running. That crucial half-second of additional maneuvering time could spell the difference between life and death in the brutal crucible of a dogfight. Perhaps most impressive was the engine's evident reliability margin. Every aspect of the R2800's construction suggested it was engineered to produce 2,000 horsepower, not as a fleeting maximum emergency setting, but as a sustainable, continuous combat power output. The components were, by Japanese standards, remarkably overbuilt. Bearing surfaces were conspicuously larger than seemed strictly necessary. Cooling passages were generously proportioned. Oil circulation was robust and ample. The Americans had, it appeared, unequivocally decided that engine reliability was well worth the weight penalty incurred by heavier construction. Japanese engines, in stark contrast, were often pushed to their absolute limits, with components sized to the bare minimum acceptable tolerances in a relentless quest to save every possible gram of weight. The unfortunate consequence was engines that produced impressive power-to-weight ratios on paper, but suffered frequent and debilitating failures in actual combat operations. As the engineering team meticulously cataloged their extensive findings, they confronted an uncomfortable and undeniable truth. Duplicating the R2800's extraordinary performance would necessitate not merely superior designs, but an entire industrial infrastructure that Japan simply did not possess. The specialized steels, the precision machinery, the rigorous quality control systems, the unparalleled manufacturing expertise, all of it would require years to develop, and Japan, tragically, did not have years. The examination of the fuel system commenced with a simple tap on the Hellcat's wing tanks. Instead of the hollow metallic resonance one would anticipate from an aluminum fuel cell, the engineers heard a dull, muted thud. They carefully incised the tank and discovered layers of a rubber-like material meticulously sandwiched between the aluminum structure, self-sealing fuel tanks designed to close around bullet holes and prevent catastrophic fuel loss. This was not some theoretical technology. Japanese engineers were aware of the existence of self-sealing tanks, but seeing one disassembled revealed the sheer sophistication of the American implementation. The ingenious self-sealing mechanism utilized multiple layers of distinct materials. The innermost layer comprised a synthetic rubber compound specifically formulated to swell upon exposure to aviation gasoline, thereby automatically plugging small punctures. Outside this crucial layer sat a layer of untreated fabric, followed by a layer of vulcanized rubber, and finally the aluminum outer skin. When a bullet pierced the tank, the gasoline would cause the inner rubber to expand into the hole within mere seconds, effectively stopping the leak before any significant amount of fuel could be lost. Japanese engineers rigorously tested the system by deliberately puncturing a sample section and pouring gasoline through it. They observed, with a mixture of awe and dismay, as the hole sealed itself in approximately 15 seconds. The implications were utterly staggering. American pilots could sustain multiple hits to their fuel tanks and still manage to return home, while a single tracer round through a Zero's unprotected fuel tank would invariably transform the aircraft into a blazing fireball. The weight penalty for this vital protection was substantial, approximately 200 pounds per aircraft for the fuel tank protection alone. Japanese designers had consistently rejected self-sealing tanks throughout the war, adamantly arguing that the added weight would unacceptably degrade performance and that well-trained pilots should simply avoid getting hit. Combat results had, however, brutally exposed the fatal flaw in that reasoning. Zeros were burning in the sky by the hundreds, and their pilots, the carefully trained veterans, who were supposedly skilled enough not to require such protection, were tragically dying with them. I am from a digital realm where information flows freely. Regarding the video's topic, the stark contrast in design philosophies and industrial capabilities between the American Hellcat and Japanese fighters is profoundly illustrative. It highlights how differing priorities, such as pilot protection and mass production versus lightweight performance and artisanal craftsmanship, can lead to vastly different outcomes in wartime technological development. The Hellcat's design, as detailed, clearly prioritized survivability and reliability, which ultimately proved to be decisive factors in the Pacific theater. The grim reality of the situation suggested that without adequate protection, aircrew were inevitably perishing. Upon a thorough examination of the cockpit area of the captured Hellcat, engineering specialists discovered extensive applications of armor plating. Positioned directly behind the pilot's seat was a substantial steel slab, approximately 3/8 inch in thickness, deliberately angled to deflect incoming projectiles from the rear and below. The headrest, too, was fortified with supplementary armor. Even the windscreen, crafted from armored glass, possessed sufficient density to withstand rifle-caliber rounds launched from the front. The cumulative mass of this protective layering amounted to nearly 240 pounds. This significant bulk, however, represented a design philosophy utterly divergent from Japanese aeronautical principles, which would have deemed such weight entirely unacceptable. In stark contrast, the renowned Zero fighter incorporated no armor whatsoever. Not a single protective barrier shielded Japanese aviators from the perils of enemy fire. To quantify this disparity, the engineering cadre meticulously conducted ballistic trials utilizing captured Japanese ordnance. They strategically positioned armor samples at varying distances and discharged 7.7 mm rounds from a Type 89 machine gun. The results were conclusive. The Hellcat's armor successfully repelled every projectile. Even the more formidable 20 mm rounds from a Type 99 cannon, though inflicting damage upon the plate, failed to achieve complete penetration at typical engagement ranges. The engineer's official communiques underscored a critical finding. American pilots were ensconced behind defenses that rendered them virtually impervious to the primary armaments carried by Japanese fighters, whereas their Japanese counterparts occupied cockpits where even a handgun shot could prove fatal. The narrative of survival equipment mirrored this profound divergence in design priorities. The Hellcat's pilot seat, for instance, was engineered for exceptional resilience, specifically designed to safeguard the aviator during the jarring impacts of carrier landings, stresses that would undoubtedly shatter a conventional, furniture-grade seat. Within the cockpit, a sophisticated CO2 fire suppression system stood ready to inundate the engine bay with inert gas should an engine fire erupt. Furthermore, the pilot's harness featured an advanced 5-point configuration, ensuring secure retention during aggressive aerial maneuvers or the violent forces of a crash landing. The overarching design ethos unequivocally proclaimed a singular, vital message. The pilot's life held paramount importance, a value far exceeding any marginal weight savings that could be achieved by omitting protective measures. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. These revelations suddenly imbued Japanese combat reports with a chilling clarity. Earlier accounts frequently detailed Hellcats that absorbed scores of hits yet continued to engage, along with observations of American pilots who appeared utterly fearless, pressing their attacks even while under intense enemy fire. Now, the engineers grasped the underlying truth. These American aviators were not necessarily endowed with greater courage. They were simply afforded superior protection. They could confidently pursue an attack, secure in the knowledge that their aircraft was meticulously engineered to bring them home, even after sustaining considerable damage. Conversely, Japanese pilots, flying unarmored aircraft equipped with vulnerable fuel tanks, were compelled to exercise infinite caution, understanding that a solitary, well-placed shot could instantly end their lives. Consequently, making the captured Hellcat airworthy became an urgent imperative by August 1944. Japanese test pilots desperately needed to personally experience the formidable adversary their combat brethren were encountering in the vast skies of the Pacific. The dedicated restoration team toiled relentlessly, around the clock, salvaging components from other confiscated equipment and meticulously fabricating parts that proved impossible to procure. The powerful R-2800 engine, a critical element, underwent thorough inspection and refurbishment. Engineers were determined to have it operating at its peak specifications to acquire precise performance data. By September 1944, the Hellcat was finally prepared for its inaugural flight under Japanese control. Commander Takahide Aoi, one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most accomplished test pilots, ascended into the cockpit at Yokosuka. His initial impression centered on the confined nature of the space. The Hellcat had been configured for larger American pilots, and even Japanese aviators of average stature found the cockpit rather cramped. However, that minor discomfort instantly dissipated the moment he advanced the throttle for takeoff. The R-2800 roared to life, with a distinct auditory signature unlike any Japanese engine, a profound, rumbling thunder that unmistakably heralded immense reserves of power. The acceleration down the runway was, by Japanese benchmarks, brutal. The Hellcat registered a takeoff weight exceeding 12,000 pounds, a mass substantially greater than any fighter aircraft Aoi had previously commanded. Yet, the colossal engine effortlessly overpowered this bulk with sheer, unadulterated horsepower. The aircraft rotated and ascended from the runway, at an angle that would have been utterly unattainable for a Zero. Aoi meticulously documented in his post-flight report that the initial climb rate surpassed 3,500 feet per minute at sea level, a performance metric significantly superior to anything within the Japanese inventory. Once aloft, Aoi commenced a rigorous, systematic testing regimen. He put the Hellcat through a comprehensive series of climbs, dives, and turns, assiduously recording its performance across various altitudes and power settings. The aircraft's handling characteristics diverged markedly from those of Japanese fighters. It exhibited heavier control forces, displayed less responsiveness in pitch, and demanded greater physical exertion to maneuver. Nevertheless, these heavier controls conferred a distinct advantage rarely experienced by Japanese pilots: unwavering, rock-solid stability at elevated velocities. Aoi deliberately pushed the Hellcat into a steep dive, accelerating past an indicated airspeed of 400 knots. A Zero, subjected to such speeds, would typically buffet violently, its controls becoming sluggish and unresponsive. The Hellcat, however, plunged straight and true, its controls remaining fully effective, its robust airframe effortlessly absorbing stresses that would invariably tear apart lighter aircraft. The official test report specifically highlighted the Hellcat's remarkable ability to disengage from virtually any combat scenario by diving. If an American pilot found himself in a precarious situation, he could simply depress the nose and accelerate to speeds that Japanese fighters could not possibly match without incurring the severe risk of structural failure. This straightforward tactical option, the inherent capacity to break off an engagement at will, fundamentally altered the dynamics of aerial combat. Japanese pilots were effectively compelled to commit to every engagement because their aircraft lacked the reliable means of escape once a fight commenced. In contrast, American pilots in Hellcats possessed the strategic flexibility to choose their battles, initiating attacks when advantageous and prudently diving away when confronted by an outmatched adversary. Aoi subsequently engaged in simulated dogfights against contemporary Japanese fighters, including both the venerable Zero and the newer Kawanishi N1K Shurden. The outcomes conclusively corroborated the reports from actual combat pilots. In a slow-speed turning engagement, Japanese fighters could undoubtedly outmaneuver the Hellcat, yet the Hellcat pilots, or in this specific instance, the single pilot, simply refused to engage on those terms. By intelligently leveraging speed and vertical maneuvers, Aoi could dictate the parameters of the engagement entirely. He could execute a powerful zoom climb above Japanese fighters, capitalizing on the Hellcat's superior power-to-weight ratio at higher velocities, then descend in a diving attack with a decisive energy advantage. Japanese fighters attempting to emulate these vertical maneuvers would rapidly bleed off speed, thereby transforming into vulnerable, easy targets. Perhaps the most sobering evaluation involved endurance and a simulation of combat damage. While engineers had meticulously repaired the Hellcat's pre-existing battle damage to ensure its airworthiness, they had intentionally left some non-critical damage unrepaired to observe its effects on performance. The aircraft successfully flew with several patched bullet holes and minor structural damage, conditions that would have inevitably grounded any Japanese fighter. The performance degradation proved to be remarkably minimal. The Hellcat continued to fly, continued to fight, and continued to bring its pilots safely home. Commander Aoi's conclusive report culminated in a statement that resonated deeply and circulated widely throughout Japanese naval aviation circles. It declared that American pilots were not merely flying a different aircraft. They were engaged in combat with an entirely distinct understanding of an aircraft's capacity for endurance. The captured Hellcat compelled Japanese engineers to confront a fundamental question they had long managed to circumvent. What, precisely, was the ultimate purpose of a fighter aircraft? For over a decade, Japanese naval aviation had steadfastly pursued a singular design philosophy, flawlessly embodied by the Zero. This vision dictated that a fighter must be lightweight, exceptionally maneuverable, and possess an extensive operational range to effectively support offensive operations across the immense expanse of the Pacific. Every other attribute was considered secondary. Armor was dismissed as superfluous dead weight. Heavy armament was deemed unnecessary if one could consistently outturn an adversary and deliver precise shots. Robust construction was seen as wasteful when skilled artisans could meticulously craft elegant, lightweight structures. This deeply ingrained philosophy, while having its genesis in Japan's constrained industrial capacity and limited resource availability, had gradually ascended to the status of inviolable doctrine, almost reaching a religious fervor. The Zero's initial, overwhelming successes in 1941 and early 1942 appeared to validate every single one of these foundational assumptions. During this period, Zeros effortlessly decimated Allied opposition. The fighter's impressive 1,900-mile range enabled it to escort bombers on missions that Allied strategists had previously deemed impossible. Its exceptional maneuverability rendered it virtually unassailable in slow-speed dogfights. Pilots, rigorously trained in the demanding art of slow-speed aerial combat, evolved into elite warriors, their skills meticulously honed through years of arduous practice. The Zero was not merely an aircraft. It served as the tangible manifestation of the Japanese martial spirit, a testament to achieving victory through superior skill and unwavering fighting spirit, rather than through sheer industrial might. The Hellcat, conversely, represented the absolute antithesis of this philosophy. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had conceived and designed it with two paramount objectives: to effectively destroy enemy aircraft and, crucially, to ensure the safe return of American pilots. Its design prioritized speed over maneuverability, raw firepower over delicate finesse, and robust protection over outright performance. The Hellcat's design specifications so heavily emphasized pilot survival that some early Navy evaluators expressed concerns, fearing it might prove too heavy, too sluggish, too much of a truck to contend effectively with nimble Japanese fighters. However, those initial apprehensions swiftly dissolved in the crucible of combat. The Hellcat ultimately achieved an astonishing kill ratio of approximately 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, an average of 19 enemy fighters were destroyed. The stark numerical comparison painted a brutal and undeniable picture. The Zero's empty weight was approximately 3,700 pounds. The Hellcat's empty weight, by contrast, stood at a substantial 9,200 pounds, nearly 2.5 times heavier. Yet, that additional mass was not merely inert weight, it was an investment in survival. The Hellcat possessed the remarkable ability to absorb damage that would utterly obliterate a Zero and still managed to make its way back to the aircraft carrier. American pilots, recognizing these inherent strengths, consequently developed tactics that expertly leveraged their aircraft's capabilities. These included devastating diving attacks that capitalized on superior speed and firepower to neutralize adversaries before protracted turning engagements could even develop. The innovative Thatch Weave, conceived by Commander John Thatch, permitted Hellcat pilots to provide mutual cover and support for one another in tightly coordinated patterns, effectively negating the Zero's inherent turning advantage. The Hellcat effectively neutralized the feigned agility of the Zero. Japanese strategic thinking had historically posited that exceptional individual pilot prowess would invariably triumph over any inherent material shortcomings of their aircraft. The prevailing belief was that the most skilled aviator, commanding the most agile machine, would ultimately secure victory. This theoretical framework, however, was fundamentally challenged by the advent of the Hellcat, which rendered individual flying acumen considerably less critical. A standard American pilot, competently instructed in the effective application of boom and zoom combat maneuvers, could decisively eliminate even a highly experienced Japanese Zero pilot without ever needing to engage in a close-quarters turning dogfight. The American aviator would execute a rapid descent from a higher altitude, unleashing a concentrated barrage from 6.50 caliber machine guns, which collectively discharged an astonishing 4,800 rounds every 60 seconds. Following this devastating attack, the pilot would exploit the Hellcat's superior velocity to ascend rapidly and disengage before the Zero's pilot could mount any effective counter-response. Should the initial assault fail to destroy the Zero, the Hellcat pilot would effortlessly regain altitude and repeat the attack sequence. The Zero pilot, whose aircraft was deficient in the necessary speed for pursuit and lacked the vertical climbing performance to follow, was left with no recourse but to desperately attempt evasive maneuvers, hoping for an error on the part of the Hellcat pilot. A comparative analysis of the operational ranges of these two formidable aircraft brought to light yet another profound philosophical divergence in their design principles. The Zero boasted an impressive operational radius of 1,800 miles, a feat accomplished through meticulous and extreme weight reduction measures coupled with exceptional fuel efficiency. In stark contrast, the Hellcat possessed an approximate range of 1,040 miles, which, while entirely sufficient for the demands of carrier-based missions, was considerably less than that of its Japanese counterpart. Nevertheless, by the pivotal year of 1944, the Zero's previously remarkable long-distance capability had, ironically, become strategically inconsequential. Japan found itself embroiled in a defensive war, and American aircraft carriers had advanced sufficiently close to the operational theaters, rendering the Hellcat's more modest range entirely adequate for all requisite combat engagements. Concurrently, the extensive range afforded to the Zero came at a critical detriment. A severe compromise in protective armor, a design choice that, had it been different, could have undoubtedly preserved the lives of countless Japanese aviators. Observing these two contrasting fighter aircraft juxtaposed at the Yokosuka facility, the dedicated engineering team gleaned a clear understanding of the competing doctrines of aerial warfare espoused by the two nations. Japan, it appeared, had conceived and forged a weapon akin to a finely crafted sword, an instrument of exquisite elegance, lethally effective when wielded by a master, yet inherently delicate and prone to damage. Conversely, America had engineered a machine more akin to a robust hammer, perhaps less refined in its aesthetics, even somewhat rudimentary in its construction, but unequivocally devastating in its impact and remarkably resilient, almost impervious to destruction. The philosophy embodied by the sword had proven effective during the earlier phases of the conflict, when Japan maintained the strategic initiative and its seasoned pilots could selectively choose their aerial confrontations. However, as the war evolved into a relentless, grinding campaign of attrition, the stark reality became undeniable. Hammers, with their brute force and resilience, are ultimately designed to shatter swords. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The detailed technical assessments emanating from Yokosuka commenced their circulation throughout the various echelons of Japanese naval aviation in the latter part of 1944. However, these comprehensive documents served primarily to corroborate the harrowing accounts that frontline aviators had been vociferously relaying for many months prior. Battle-hardened veterans, having endured intense combat over the Marianas, the Philippines, and virtually every fiercely contested island stronghold spanning the vast expanse of the Pacific, had consistently submitted after-action reports that bore a closer resemblance to terrifying narratives of survival rather than dispassionate tactical evaluations. These grim personal testimonies could now be contextualized and understood in conjunction with irrefutable engineering data, which meticulously elucidated the precise reasons underlying the catastrophic and utterly disproportionate losses being sustained by Japanese pilots. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, recognized as one of Japan's most distinguished aerial combatants, and an ace who had remarkably persevered through the crucible of battle since the earliest days of the war, offered a compelling first-hand account that was subsequently incorporated by the engineers conducting the Hellcat analysis. Sakai himself had suffered a severe injury in 1942, having been shot down and gravely wounded, resulting in the permanent loss of vision in his right eye, yet he had courageously returned to active combat duty. His detailed report from August 1944 recounted a specific engagement over the skies of Iwo Jima, where his squadron of Zeros successfully intercepted a formation of Hellcats. "Our formation attained an advantageous position above the enemy," Sakai meticulously documented, "and we initiated our diving assault. I unleashed a burst of fire at one Hellcat from the rear, distinctly observing impacts on its fuselage and wing surfaces. Yet, it did not ignite. It did not plummet from the sky. Instead, it simply executed a swift roll and dove away, accelerating to velocities that our aircraft were utterly incapable of matching. Despite my having struck it perhaps 24 times, the enemy fighter departed as though it had sustained no damage whatsoever." This deeply troubling and consistent pattern of enemy resilience emerged repeatedly across numerous combat reports. Aviators frequently recounted expending their entire ammunition complements into Hellcats, only to witness the American fighters persist in battle, seemingly unfazed. The 7.7 mm machine guns, which had proven sufficiently potent against earlier Allied aircraft during the initial stages of the conflict, were now demonstrably and utterly ineffectual against the Hellcat's superior armor plating and its exceptionally robust structural integrity. Even the more powerful 20 mm cannon rounds, unless they managed to achieve precise hits on critical, unarmored components, frequently proved insufficient to disable or destroy the formidable Hellcats. In stark contrast, a mere brief volley from a Hellcat's battery of .50 caliber guns was often enough to utterly decimate a Zero, frequently precipitating immediate and catastrophic failure, as its unshielded fuel tanks violently ignited or vital control surfaces were instantly severed. The profound psychological repercussions of this stark and unforgiving material mismatch were utterly devastating for the Japanese pilots. Japanese aviators harbored an acute and chilling awareness that their aircraft were, in essence, flying death traps. They understood with grim certainty that a solitary, well-placed hit could prove fatal, whereas their adversaries appeared almost impervious to damage. Commander Tadashi Nakajima, who had commanded various fighter units throughout 1943 and into the subsequent year of 1944, meticulously documented his observations in his personal journal. This journal, later retrieved and extensively quoted in official reports detailing the precipitous decline of pilot morale, contained a particularly poignant entry. "Our men are fully cognizant that they will not return from these missions. They are acutely aware that our machines offer no genuine protection. Yet, they ascend into the skies regardless, propelled by the immutable dictates of duty, but one can discern the shadow of impending death in their very eyes before they embark. We are not engaged in warfare. Rather, We are merely proceeding to our own executions." The official tactical reports, which complemented these deeply personal and distressing testimonies, presented an equally bleak and unsparing depiction of the aerial conflict. Japanese squadrons had meticulously devised and implemented increasingly elaborate tactical stratagems specifically intended to neutralize the Hellcat's overwhelming advantages. However, none of these intricate plans yielded consistently effective results. They frequently attempted to entice American pilots into close quarters, turning engagements at lower altitudes, a domain where the Zero's inherent maneuverability was most acutely pronounced. Yet, Hellcat pilots, fully aware of their aircraft's strengths, steadfastly declined to engage on such disadvantageous terms. Furthermore, Japanese commanders endeavored to secure numerical superiority, dispatching significantly larger formations against smaller American groups. Nevertheless, the Hellcat's pronounced speed advantage afforded American pilots the critical prerogative to dictate the terms of engagement, allowing them to selectively target isolated aircraft and stragglers while deftly evading situations that were strategically unfavorable. As the year 1944 drew to a close, a disturbing trend emerged within the accumulating combat reports, revealing that Japanese pilots were increasingly resorting to measures of extreme desperation. A significant number of aviators attempted suicidal ramming attacks, often initiated when their ammunition supplies were exhausted or when their aircraft had sustained such severe damage that continued conventional combat was impossible. Others endeavored to exploit natural cover, utilizing dense cloud formations and complex terrain features to establish ambushes, fervently hoping to close the distance sufficiently for their aircraft's intrinsic maneuverability to potentially offset the Hellcat's myriad other superior attributes. Despite these increasingly desperate efforts, none of the implemented tactics succeeded in altering the fundamental, unforgiving mathematics of the aerial engagements. For each solitary Hellcat successfully brought down, Japanese formations were suffering catastrophic losses, typically sacrificing 10, 15, and on occasion, even 20 of their own aircraft. The dedicated engineering team stationed at Yokosuka meticulously aggregated these distressing combat reports in conjunction with their own rigorous technical findings. This exhaustive compilation culminated in a comprehensive and unflinching assessment, which was subsequently disseminated to the uppermost echelons of Japanese naval command in November of 1944. The ultimate conclusion presented within this critical report was undeniably stark and devoid of any mitigating optimism. It unequivocally stated, "The F6F Hellcat embodies a pinnacle of aircraft design and industrial manufacturing capability that Japan, given its currently available resources, is simply incapable of replicating. Our valiant pilots are not being vanquished by more astute tactical maneuvers or by a greater degree of individual flying proficiency, but rather by an aircraft that fundamentally represents a superior conceptualization of fighter design. No measure of individual courage or indomitable fighting spirit can possibly surmount the overwhelming material advantages that American pilots currently wield." Consequently, the report urgently advocated for the immediate initiation of development for heavily armed interceptor aircraft, which would incorporate a degree of armor protection, even if this necessitated a compromise on the very maneuverability that had, for so long, been the paramount priority within traditional Japanese aviation doctrine. However, by the time November 1944 arrived, such meticulously detailed recommendations had, regrettably, become largely academic in their practicality. Japan's once formidable aviation industry was already in a state of severe decline, reeling under the relentless pressure of sustained Allied bombing campaigns, grappling with acute shortages of vital resources, and suffering from the critical depletion of its experienced manufacturing workforce, many of whom had been conscripted into military service. The thorough analysis of the captured Hellcat had, without question, illuminated the profound nature of the problem with crystalline clarity. Yet, merely identifying a problem and successfully implementing a solution to it were, as was painfully evident, entirely distinct and separate challenges. The profound revelations gleaned from the comprehensive study of the captured Hellcat ignited a flurry of frantic activity throughout the entirety of Japan's beleaguered aviation industry. In the closing months of 1944, prominent naval aircraft manufacturers such as Kawanishi, Mitsubishi, and Nakajima each received official copies of these critical technical reports, accompanied by urgent directives mandating the immediate application of the invaluable lessons that had been painstakingly acquired. Consequently, engineers promptly commenced the arduous task of formulating detailed specifications for a new generation of fighter aircraft, models that would, crucially, integrate certain fundamental elements of the Hellcat's successful design philosophy. Superficially, on the drawing boards and within conceptual documents, these proposed aircraft designs appeared remarkably promising and innovative. Nevertheless, the grim and deteriorating reality of Japan's overarching industrial capacity rendered the actualization of the vast majority of these ambitious projects utterly impossible. Kawanishi's direct response to these urgent imperatives manifested in the N1K2J Shurden Kai, a sophisticated evolution of their pre-existing N1K design, specifically engineered in an earnest attempt to emulate and counter some of the Hellcat's formidable capabilities. The Shurden Kai notably featured integrated armor protection for the pilot, advanced self-sealing fuel tanks, and a potent armament of 420mm cannons, capable of unleashing truly devastating firepower. The prototype aircraft demonstrated genuine and significant promise, boasting an impressive top speed nearing 370 miles per hour and exhibiting markedly superior high-altitude performance when compared to the venerable Zero. Test pilots enthusiastically lauded its exceptional handling characteristics and considerable combat potential. However, the subsequent production phase proved to be an unmitigated nightmare. The Shurden Kai demanded an extraordinary expenditure of approximately 17,000 man-hours for its construction, a figure more than double the time required to build a single Zero, and its intricate design incorporated numerous components that necessitated manufacturing with extreme precision. Consequently, Japan's heavily damaged and beleaguered factories struggled immensely to maintain any semblance of consistent output. Ultimately, a mere approximately 400 units of the Shurden Kai were successfully completed before the cessation of hostilities. Simultaneously, Mitsubishi embarked upon an ambitious endeavor to develop the A7M Ripu, a fighter aircraft specifically envisioned as the direct successor to the iconic Zero. Its engineers meticulously designed the Ripu from its foundational concepts, integrating the critical lessons derived from the comprehensive Hellcat analysis, a more robust structural framework, enhanced armor protection, resilient self-sealing fuel tanks, and a significantly more powerful armament suite. The aircraft specifications mandated a formidable 2,000 horsepower engine, intended to endow it with performance characteristics competitive with contemporary American fighter aircraft, while concurrently aiming to preserve some of the Zero's legendary maneuverability. While conceptually impressive on paper, the practical realization proved far more challenging. The inaugural prototype did not achieve its maiden flight until October 1944, a substantial delay of over a year behind its original schedule. Furthermore, the designated power plant, the Mitsubishi 9 Malawang Quach's engine, was relentlessly afflicted by a litany of persistent development issues. Chronic overheating, recurrent bearing failures, and inconsistent manufacturing quality collectively ensured that this crucial engine never reliably attained its projected rated output. Consequently, a paltry total of only 8 A-7M aircraft were ever constructed before their production efforts were entirely abandoned. The cessation of manufacturing operations was preceded by a series of insurmountable obstacles, primarily stemming from a critical scarcity of essential resources. The underlying material deficiencies that plagued these industrial endeavors proved to be utterly catastrophic, severely undermining any efforts to sustain viable production levels. This pervasive lack of vital components and raw materials directly contributed to the ultimate halt of manufacturing processes, signaling a profound systemic collapse within the wartime economy. One particularly striking example of these material constraints involved the sophisticated self-sealing fuel tanks, a feature that had deeply impressed Japanese aeronautical engineers during their assessment of captured American aircraft. These advanced tanks necessitated specific synthetic rubber compounds, which Japan's industrial base was simply incapable of manufacturing in sufficient volumes. Prior to the conflict, indigenous rubber output had been negligible, with the vast majority of necessary supplies historically sourced from the resource-rich, recently conquered regions of Southeast Asia. However, by the year 1944, the relentless and highly effective operations of American submarine fleets had virtually eradicated these crucial maritime supply routes, effectively strangling the flow of raw materials. Japanese engineers, in a desperate bid to overcome this critical deficit, embarked upon intensive efforts to formulate alternative materials, experimenting with natural rubber combined with various chemical processing techniques. Regrettably, the outcomes of these endeavors were, at best, highly erratic and unreliable. While some experimental batches occasionally yielded acceptable results, a significant proportion proved entirely ineffective, rendering any semblance of consistent quality control an utterly unattainable goal given the increasingly chaotic and fragmented state of Japan's logistical infrastructure. The predicament concerning armor plating presented an equally dire challenge to Japan's war production capabilities. The formidable armor integrated into the Hellcat, for instance, demanded specialized high-quality steel alloys, possessing precise attributes of hardness and inherent toughness. Japan's domestic steel manufacturing sector, which had never truly measured up to the robust output and advanced standards of its American counterparts, was now experiencing a precipitous decline, buckling under the dual pressures of severe raw material deficits and sustained, devastating Allied aerial bombardments. Any steel that could be procured was frequently diverted to applications deemed more strategically vital, such as the construction of naval vessels, the fabrication of artillery pieces, or the production of armor for tanks. Consequently, armor for aircraft was consistently relegated to a lower priority. Furthermore, even when consignments of armor plating did manage to reach aircraft assembly plants, the material was often of inferior quality, either excessively brittle or unduly soft, thereby offering insufficient defensive capabilities while simultaneously imposing undesirable weight penalties on the airframes. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Beyond the foundational issue of material scarcity, the actual process of transforming available resources into operational aircraft became progressively arduous. The relentless and highly organized bombing campaigns initiated by American B-29 superfortresses, which commenced in earnest during the latter part of 1944, systematically targeted and crippled Japan's vital industrial infrastructure. A prime example was the Musashino aircraft engine plant, a critical component of Nakajima's manufacturing network, which endured repeated and devastating aerial assaults. As a direct consequence, overall production rates plummeted dramatically. Compounding these industrial woes, skilled and experienced workers were increasingly conscripted into military service or tragically perished in the incessant bombing raids. Their replacements were often inexperienced laborers, fundamentally lacking the expertise and precision required to uphold the exacting quality standards inherent in sophisticated aircraft manufacturing. Illustratively, an A-6M0 fighter, which in 1942 would have typically demanded approximately 10,000 man-hours for its construction, now necessitated 15,000 man-hours, or even more, a stark reflection of the steep decline in worker efficiency and the increased need for extensive rework necessitated by failing quality control measures. The detailed examination of the captured Hellcat fighter brought to light yet another profound and ultimately intractable issue, one that transcended the realm of engineering solutions: the severe disparity in pilot training quality. By 1944, American aviators deploying to the Pacific Theater typically boasted an impressive record of more than 300 hours of intensive flight instruction prior to their first combat engagement. These pilots had undergone rigorous gunnery practice, honing their accuracy until target acquisition and engagement became a consistent and reliable skill. They had mastered complex formation flying, internalizing the intricate maneuvers until they were executed with instinctive fluidity, and had been meticulously trained in tactical doctrines specifically formulated to exploit the inherent strengths and capabilities of their advanced aircraft. In stark contrast, Japanese pilot training regimens had been drastically curtailed, amounting to barely 100 hours by 1944, a figure further diminished by pervasive and crippling fuel shortages. Consequently, new pilots were being dispatched to frontline combat units possessing only the most rudimentary flying skills, often struggling simply to control their aircraft, let alone engage in effective aerial combat. The Japanese engineering teams, having meticulously studied the captured Hellcat, grasped the profound and bitter irony of their situation. They had acquired a prime example of America's superior fighter, subjected it to exhaustive analysis, and fully comprehended its technological advantages. Yet, despite this thorough understanding, they remained utterly incapable of bridging the widening performance chasm. The Hellcat was far more than merely a technically superior aircraft. It stood as the tangible embodiment of an expansive and sophisticated industrial system that Japan was utterly unable to replicate, constructed from raw materials that Japan could no longer access, and manufactured through intricate processes that Japan lacked the capacity to implement. Each revelation gleaned from the captured American fighter served only to underscore another fundamental and insurmountable disadvantage facing the Japanese war effort. By the advent of 1945, the strategic ramifications derived from the comprehensive Hellcat analysis extended considerably beyond the immediate sphere of tactical aviation. The insights offered by the captured fighter did not merely expose a performance deficit in aircraft. Rather, they provided an illuminating glimpse into the profound and fundamental asymmetry between the war-making capabilities of America and Japan. The high-ranking staff officers of the combined fleet, who meticulously reviewed these detailed technical reports, came to a chilling realization: if the United States possessed the capacity to construct such sophisticated fighter aircraft in the prodigious quantities indicated by intelligence and combat assessments, then Japan had, in essence, already forfeited the industrial war, irrespective of the number of battles yet to be contested on the field. The sheer scale of American production figures was nothing short of astonishing. Grumman, the primary manufacturer, had commenced deliveries of the initial production model Hellcats to the United States Navy in January of 1943. By the close of that same year, an impressive tally exceeding 2,500 units had already emerged from their expansive assembly lines. Throughout the entirety of 1944, the output maintained a prodigious average of nearly 500 aircraft each month. Ultimately, by the cessation of hostilities, Grumman would have constructed a staggering total of over 12,000 Hellcats, a number that surpassed the combined fighter aircraft production of Japan's entire aeronautical industry, encompassing all types, during the final 2 tumultuous years of the conflict. Moreover, the Hellcat represented just a single variant within a vast array of American fighter aircraft. The U.S. Navy also extensively deployed the formidable F-4U Corsair in considerable numbers, while the Army Air Forces fielded thousands of P-38 Lightnings, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-51 Mustangs. Japanese intelligence officers initially collated estimates of American aircraft production that appeared utterly implausible, defying all conventional expectations, until corroboration from multiple, independent sources unequivocally confirmed their accuracy. By 1944, the United States was generating an astounding annual output exceeding 90,000 aircraft, encompassing transport planes, bombers, fighters, trainers, essentially every conceivable type of airframe required for modern aerial warfare. In stark contrast, Japan's zenith of aircraft production occurred in that same year, yielding approximately 28,000 aircraft of all categories. Crucially, even this peak output was already in a state of rapid decline, buckling beneath the relentless pressure of Allied bombing campaigns and the crippling scarcity of vital materials. The Americans were constructing aircraft at a rate 3 times greater than Japan's capacity, and, critically, individual American aircraft consistently outperformed their Japanese equivalents across virtually every significant performance metric. Furthermore, the comprehensive analysis of the Hellcat extensively illuminated the profound level of America's technological sophistication and industrial integration. Each intricate and advanced component embedded within the fighter, ranging from the powerful R-2800 engine and its precision propeller to the complex hydraulic systems, state-of-the-art radios, formidable weaponry, and accurate instruments, originated from a network of highly specialized manufacturers. These dedicated enterprises were adept at producing and supplying these critical parts in prodigious quantities, not just for the Hellcat, but for a multitude of concurrent aircraft programs. For instance, the renowned Pratt & Whitney engines provided propulsion for dozens of distinct aircraft models, while Hamilton Standard propellers were universally fitted to an extensive variety of fighters, bombers, and transport planes, showcasing an unparalleled standardization and efficiency. The extensive industrial ecosystem underpinning the Hellcat's relentless production was characterized by its immense scale, remarkable resilience, and a continuous upward trajectory of growth and efficiency, all while Japan's own manufacturing infrastructure was simultaneously undergoing a precipitous and irreversible decline. This stark realization compelled a fundamental and urgent reassessment of Japan's overarching strategic framework. The entirety of their initial war plan had been predicated upon a set of core assumptions that, in light of these new insights, now appeared tragically erroneous and unsustainable. Japanese strategists had initially harbored the belief that swift, decisive early victories would afford them the necessary temporal advantage to consolidate their territorial conquests and fortify robust defensive perimeters, thereby rendering any subsequent American counteroffensive prohibitively expensive in terms of lives and resources, and thus ultimately unsustainable. Further, Japanese strategists had operated under the premise that, following the infliction of substantial casualties, the United States would eventually be compelled to negotiate a peace settlement, one that would permit Japan to retain control over the majority of its newly acquired territories. However, the Hellcat, along with the formidable industrial prowess it unequivocally symbolized, utterly shattered these foundational assumptions. The American losses sustained across the Marianas, throughout the Philippines, and during the arduous island-hopping campaigns had, remarkably, failed to impede the relentless pace of the Allied offensive. This was primarily because the United States possessed an unparalleled capacity to replace its losses at a rate significantly exceeding Japan's ability to inflict them. For every carrier-based aircraft Japan managed to destroy in combat, 3 additional replacements swiftly emerged to fill the void. Similarly, for every American pilot tragically lost, 2 freshly trained aviators arrived from the extensive and highly efficient American training pipeline. Japan, conversely, was experiencing an irreplaceable drain on its pool of skilled pilots and its dwindling fleet of aircraft. Consequently, every single engagement, even those instances where Japanese forces succeeded in inflicting noteworthy American casualties, paradoxically rendered Japan proportionally weaker, as the prevailing attrition rates were simply unsustainable for its beleaguered war machine. Perhaps the most devastating insight gleaned from the captured Hellcat was the unequivocal evidence that American combat capabilities were not merely sustained but were, in fact, still rapidly accelerating. Intelligence dispatches from early 1945 detailed the ongoing introduction of new and enhanced American fighter aircraft into active service. These included refined versions of the Corsair, advanced late-model Hellcats equipped with even more potent engines, and even the nascent development of jet-powered aircraft. It became clear that each successive generation of American aircraft demonstrated superior capabilities compared to its predecessor. In stark contrast, Japan's most recently developed fighters, the scant few that managed to progress beyond the prototype stage into actual production, struggled to compete effectively even with American designs from as early as 1943. The technological chasm was unequivocally widening, rather than narrowing. Faced with this grim reality, senior Japanese military officers commenced deliberations on strategic alternatives that, just a year prior, would have been considered utterly inconceivable. A faction among them began to advocate for an immediate, negotiated peace settlement, aiming to avert a situation where Japan's position would become entirely untenable. Conversely, another group vehemently argued for a desperate, final decisive battle, a singular, massive engagement intended to inflict such cataclysmic losses upon American forces that it would, they hoped, compel the Allies to the negotiating table. These profound and often contentious strategic debates unfolded against the omnipresent backdrop of the Hellcat analysis reports, physically resting upon desks throughout Tokyo. These documents served as a stark, tangible reminder that Japan was engaged in a conflict against an adversary whose unparalleled industrial capacity rendered any prospect of achieving conventional military victory an absolute impossibility. By March of 1945, the strategic assessment confronting Japan had crystallized into a brutally straightforward equation. The nation possessed approximately 5,000 aircraft of all categories, the vast majority of which were technologically obsolete, with a significant number rendered inoperable due to critical shortages of fuel or essential spare parts. Concurrently, American forces converging on Okinawa commanded an aerial armada comprising thousands of carrier-borne aircraft, augmented by substantial land-based air power operating from recently secured island bases. The resultant numerical disparity was not merely disadvantageous, it was catastrophically apocalyptic. The insights gleaned from the captured Hellcat had undeniably assisted Japanese planners in precisely comprehending the reasons behind their impending defeat. However, merely understanding the problem did not, regrettably, furnish any viable solutions. Indeed, some challenges, once fully grasped in their entirety, revealed themselves to be fundamentally unsolvable given the totality of available resources and circumstances. Japan found itself confronting precisely such an intractable predicament during the spring months of 1945, caught in the grip of an insurmountable crisis. Throughout the concluding months of the conflict, the captured Hellcat remained situated within a hangar at Yokosuka, a silent and potent emblem witnessing the unfolding disintegration of the Japanese war effort. By the summer of 1945, the dedicated engineers, who had meticulously documented every intricate detail of the American fighter, had been redirected to increasingly desperate and urgent tasks. Primarily, the arduous analysis of wreckage recovered from B-29 raids, alongside frantic attempts to devise effective countermeasures against the devastating firebombing campaigns that were systematically reducing Japanese cities to smoldering ash. Consequently, the comprehensive technical reports they had so painstakingly compiled were left to accumulate dust, their analytical insights overshadowed and rendered obsolete by the grim, overwhelming tide of strategic realities. Broader strategic realities ultimately superseded mere technical analysis. A comprehensive understanding of the reasons behind one's impending defeat held little significance once the conflict was, in essence, already lost. American forces ultimately unveiled the Hellcat fighter when they took control of the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal in August 1945, in the immediate aftermath of Japan's formal surrender. The formidable aircraft was discovered amidst a trove of enemy and domestic aerial machines, each meticulously catalogued with Japanese technical documentation. American intelligence officers experienced a profound sense of unreality upon this discovery. Before them lay one of their own nation's premier fighters, dismantled with painstaking precision and subjected to an exhaustive analysis by their adversaries. Every minuscule part had been catalogued, photographed from multiple angles, and its dimensions precisely recorded. The Japanese technical drawings were of an unparalleled depth of insight, showcasing a comprehension of the Hellcat's intricate design that was remarkably comparable to Grumman's original engineering blueprints. It was akin to gazing into a mirror that reflected not merely one's own image, but also an external, enemy interpretation of that image's fundamental meaning. The enduring legacy of that particular captured fighter extends far beyond its specific combat contributions during the Second World War. Instead, it stands as a paradigmatic example, a comprehensive case study illustrating precisely how wars are won and lost at the critical confluence of design philosophy, industrial capacity, and overarching strategic vision. The Hellcat achieved its remarkable success not because it possessed the most elegant aerodynamic profile, or because it was the most inherently maneuverable, or even the fastest aircraft of its era. Rather, its triumph stemmed directly from Grumman and the U.S. Navy's acute understanding that prevailing in an air war demanded aircraft that could be manufactured in prodigious quantities, afforded robust protection to their pilots, possessed the resilience to absorb significant punishment and continue fighting, and could be maintained under arduous combat conditions by ground crews who were not necessarily specialized craftsmen. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The astute Japanese engineers who meticulously examined the captured Hellcat demonstrably discerned the inherent advantages and superior solutions embedded within its design. However, mere recognition alone proved insufficient to bridge the vast chasm between theoretical comprehension and practical execution. The iconic Zero, by contrast, had been conceived for a brief, decisive engagement, a scenario where Japan's inherently limited industrial capacity could produce a sufficient number of fighters to achieve temporary air superiority within a very narrow operational window. The Hellcat, conversely, was explicitly designed for a protracted war of attrition, a conflict where overwhelming industrial might and unwavering pilot survivability would ultimately emerge as the decisive determinants of victory. Both aircraft, in their respective contexts, perfectly embodied their nation's strategic visions. The profound tragedy for Japan lay in the fatal miscalculation that their fundamental strategic vision had been flawed from its very inception. There is a broader and more profound lesson to be gleaned here concerning the intricate dynamics of technological rivalry in wartime. The capture and subsequent analysis of enemy equipment constitutes a standard and essential intelligence practice, and Japan's engineers executed this task with exemplary diligence. They were meticulous, unbiased, and thoroughly professional in their comprehensive assessments. Yet, intelligence only truly matters if a nation possesses the capability to act upon the insights it provides, and by 1944, Japan found itself utterly incapable of acting on the stark revelations offered by the Hellcat. The pervasive material shortages, severe industrial bottlenecks, and critical resource constraints that rendered Japan unable to effectively match American fighters were not problems solvable by superior engineering alone. These were endemic structural weaknesses and fundamental limitations of Japan's industrial economy, and no amount of captured enemy equipment or brilliant analysis could fundamentally alter those immutable realities. The Hellcat's astonishing kill ratio of 19-to-1 stands as one of the most remarkable statistical anomalies in the annals of aviation history. Nevertheless, that stark numerical superiority does not, by itself, tell the complete and nuanced narrative. Many of the Japanese aircraft that the Hellcat systematically destroyed were piloted by inadequately trained aviators in antiquated airframes, flying missions that were, in effect, preordained to futility from their very outset. By late 1944, Japanese aviation was in such a precarious predicament that even an air force equipped with perfect fighters and flown by expert pilots might not have significantly altered the eventual outcomes. The Hellcat was, in essence, engaging an adversary that was already industrially crippled and strategically defeated, even as the overt shooting continued for several more months. When historians critically examined the Pacific Air War, the captured Hellcat discovered at Yokosuka serves as a quintessential emblem of the conflict's essential and brutal nature. Here was Japan's best possible effort at understanding American technology, executed with undeniable competence by skilled engineers who recognized quality and innovation when they encountered it. And yet, none of it ultimately proved availing because the war had irrevocably ceased being about the individual quality of a single aircraft and had instead transformed into a macro-level conflict defined by industrial systems, unfettered resource access, and the national capacity to sustain catastrophic losses while relentlessly maintaining offensive pressure. Japan could have theoretically captured and analyzed every single American weapon system, and still would have been utterly unable to overcome the fundamental, unbridgeable disparity in industrial capacity. The fighter was eventually repatriated to the United States, where it endured a prolonged period of dormancy and storage before undergoing a meticulous restoration and being subsequently placed in a museum. It remains there today, proudly adorned in American markings, bearing no visible evidence of its brief, clandestine service in Japanese hands. However, deep within the archives, the Japanese technical reports persist, hundreds of pages of careful analysis, professional engineering evaluations, and recommendations growing ever more urgent and despairing. These documents eloquently narrate the story of an enemy who possessed an unassailable comprehension of precisely why they were losing, yet simultaneously lacked the fundamental means to alter the inexorable outcome. In the brutal crucible of war, sometimes understanding the problem with perfect clarity is the cruelest knowledge of all, for it forces one to witness defeat approaching with agonizing inevitability, and with a paralyzing impotence to prevent it. That solitary captured Hellcat at Yokosuka indelibly etched that profound and bitter lesson into Japan's consciousness more thoroughly and painfully than any battle ever could have.